Today we'll be discussing the acts that were placed on the colonists by the British for the purposes of taxing them in order to pay for the debts of the French and Indian War. This series of acts raised tension between the colonists and the British that will ultimately lead to the Revolutionary War. Today's main ideas will be the acts itself. This will be presented in a timeline format where we'll quickly discuss some of the acts and what they entailed. Some of those are the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act. You can indicate what they are by the word act following what their name is. Also the Boston Tea Party, the Boston Massacre, and then ending with the Intolerable Acts. And we already discussed in class what we think that means, so you can take a second to maybe predict what you think the Intolerable Acts will entail. So as I mentioned before, in efforts to force the colonists to pay for the debts of the French and Indian War, Great Britain launched a series of acts. This not only taxed the colonists in order to pay the debts, but it also strengthened the British control of the colonies. When we discuss the differences of what the colonists consider themselves and what the British consider the colonists, and how the colonists consider themselves to be separate, the British realized that they may need more control, and a way to control them is by placing more rules on them that require them to pay money to the government that shows that they are in fact a part of Great Britain. So what are some of these acts? Beginning in 1764, they placed a Sugar Act that put a duty on several products, including molasses. Molasses is like a sugary substance. A duty is an import tax. So when we discuss imports and exports, imports are things that you take into the country. So if they are taking molasses into the colonies, there will be a tax on it because it came from somewhere else. They also had harsh punishments for smugglers, so they increased their control on how they provided consequences to the colonists as well. Shortly after, the Stamp Act required colonists to purchase special tax stamps for all products and activities. So they had to pay a certain amount to get that stamp, and in order to do certain things or to buy certain things or sell certain things, they would need to have that stamp on there. So the way they got the tax money was by buying the stamp. In an effort to control the colonists and not necessarily to make money but to save it, they issued what's called the Quartering Act. And the quartering refers to having soldiers stay in your house. And this may not seem like a very big deal, but when British soldiers just knock on your door and walk into your home and start eating your food and taking over your house, that definitely limits the privacy and the rights of the people. So the colonists were not very happy about this series of acts that were being passed. They had to pay more money for things that they used every day, and they didn't believe that they needed to be paying for the debts of the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War. So that made them upset. They also were upset about the lack of control that they had. The Quartering Act limited their rights greatly, and they felt that wasn't fair. So in response, the colonists boycotted British goods. And by boycott, I mean they decided not to use them, to buy them, and in this effort, that would cause the British to lose more money. The colonists petitioned the king and Parliament to remove the Stamp Act. A petition is when you get a piece of paper that has some kind of content on it. In this case, it would be, we are saying to remove the Stamp Act, and you get a number of people to buy it. So in 1766, the Stamp Act was successfully repealed, but then it was replaced by the Declaratory Act, which was much more serious later on. So as I mentioned, the Declaratory Act said Parliament had total authority over the colonies. So this is much worse to them than having to put these stamps on different items. So some of these colonies had things like town meetings where they practiced a democratic process, and now their say was completely taken away and the British Parliament had control. The Townshend Acts were passed in 1767, and it stated that Parliament would only tax products brought to the colonies. So they wouldn't tax anything that was taken out, but that meant that it affected the colonists more so and not the British, because anything that they brought in was taxed. Parliament also, in an effort to increase their control, issued what's called a writs of assistance. And what that is a court-ordered unannounced search without probable cause or reason. So imagine that you're sitting at home and all of a sudden the police or someone of authority walks into your house and they have no reason to be there. No one's being accused of a crime for any reason. So the threat that can happen at any time is very serious to the colonists, and they felt that their rights were being violated. So the colonists start to react in a way that becomes more and more violent than the petitions and the meetings that they were having before, writing in papers. The colonists continued to boycott British goods in order to show them that they weren't going to give them any more money than necessary. They also refused to quarter soldiers and follow orders. They were basically purposefully disobeying the government. On March 5th, 1770, the British repealed all of the Townshend Acts except for on tea. So they got many of them taken away, but tea was a very important part of the culture at this time. Right now, that may not seem like a big deal, but tea was a very valuable resource. It was also used all the time by the colonists. So what ended up happening is the colonists got very angry. And in Boston, where they had a major port to send in this tea, they had what's called the Boston Massacre. Angry colonists surrounded a British soldier and they began to throw snowballs at them. And the frightened soldiers began firing into the crowd, just kind of blindly firing, and killed 5 people. It's still debated on who started or initiated this argument and who's at fault for it, but the colonists felt like this is a time where things were growing violent and we don't know what's going to happen next. It was kind of that first hint that there might be a war that's going to begin. Going along with tea, in 1773, the Tea Act lowered the price of tea so that the British East India Tea Company could make more money and establish a monopoly. So the colonists could also export tea and make money that way. But the British were basically competing with them and not allowing them a chance to have people buy their products because tea was such a low price with the British East India Company. So they ended up taking complete control over all of the industry, or all of the companies that sold tea. And that's what a monopoly is. So this hurt the colonists' economy greatly, more than it had already been hurt by these other acts. It's called the Boston Tea Party, and you may have heard of it before, and sometimes people refer to the Tea Party in political organizations now. But what happened in history was that there was a group of colonists called the Sons of Liberty who organized these boycotts and anti-British campaigns and were really doing a lot to gain colonist pride in a time when the British were trying to bring that down. So they organized a group called the Boston Tea Party, and this group of people dressed as Native Americans boarded a tea ship and threw hundreds of cases of tea into the harbor. So they literally threw it in the water. So this is the tea that the British thought that they would sell and that they were making all this money off of, and they completely ruined it all. The Boston Tea Party outraged the British government. It made them very upset, and in response, they passed even stronger control. So we go from a pattern of taxing them for the French and Indian War to moving more so to a control basis. The British were upset that the colonists did not consider themselves part of Britain, so they continued to increase that control every time that the colonists did something to express their dislike. And the Intolerable Acts were part of that. So as part of this, they closed the port of Boston, so that was a major economic resource for Boston where they could import and export. They also increased the powers of the royal governor, so the person that was appointed by the British. So they had local control in that area. They cut the powers of the town meetings, so they no longer had a democratic process that they were used to and they felt like they could take part in. And they also strengthened the Quartering Act because that had definite direct control over individual people's lives. And it also saved the British some money. That's all for today, but very shortly we will start on the Revolutionary War and how these series of acts led the colonists and the British ultimately to fighting each other.